Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs.
This was not thought out properly. It wasn't consulted. It was a knee-jerk reaction as far as I'm concerned. And this is going to be a big problem.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping is receiving mixed reviews here in Canada. Prairie premiers are welcoming the relief for their agricultural industries. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, though, is decrying the deal as terrible for his province's auto industry. Our Sunday strategy session is here. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you again. I guess it's very late to say Happy New Year, but it is our first meeting in the new year. Scott, I'll start with you. There were a lot of discussion about the political stakes of this trip heading into it, whether there would be any specific announcement. We obviously know now that there was a specific announcement related to tariff relief on both sides to a degree. When you think about the political cost benefit of all of that to the federal government, to the Prime Minister, what do you arrive at?
High stakes. All of this is very high stakes. I mean, this is a much larger than anticipated breakthrough on trade with China, I think, both in terms of the framework and the sweep of the framework, the 5 pillars that are outlined, and then obviously the action, the reciprocal action on tariff reductions on agricultural goods and Chinese EV autos. I mean, I am really quite taken by this. It shows that Carney is willing to take on political risk. Political risk, and obviously Scott Moen, from Saskatchewan, is going to be pleased with this. Doug Ford immediately voicing his displeasure. But also political risk in terms of how does this work vis-a-vis the United States? What does this do? And from my reading of it, Carney is making a bet here. And Carney's bet is that this will strengthen his hand in CUSMA discussions, because you'll be able to go into Ford and say, go into Trump and say, like, you may regard the importation of EV vehicles as something that bothers you, but unless you want to see that schedule accelerated, then you're going to have to give a little, not just take. And it may strengthen our hand at that table. On the other hand, Donald Trump is an unpredictable bear, and so he may just erupt and roar. We'll have to wait and see. But clearly, Carney is willing to roll some dice, take some chances, and make some moves. This is a pretty bold outcome.
Were you surprised, Kory, at the sort of specificity, the scope of what was arrived at? Because the expectation setting ahead of the trip was not that there would be this sort of quid pro quo, which ended up materializing.
Well, perhaps for the first time in the history of this government, they lowered expectations and then overachieved on them, which is quite the opposite of what they have done in a number of circumstances in the past. Yeah, I'm a bit surprised. I think the politics of this, within Canada are problematic for Carney. The parts of the country that grow canola, and including my own family's farm, are pretty solidly conservative, and there's no indication that that's ever going to change. And the places that produce automobiles that are going to be hammered by this agreement are swing seats, each and every one of them. So and there were a lot of them. So I think the politics of it could be challenging for Carney.
It's interesting because when we talk about the concept of political risk, as Kory was detailing that, it reminded me it's the second time we've basically had that conversation. The MOU was the first, right? Right. Essentially, like, what do you politically have to gain from an agreement that favors Alberta and Saskatchewan, or in this case, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where you have nowhere near the electoral calculation that you would in Ontario?
Yeah, but in this one, he's evaluating his trips both to China and his upcoming trip to India. He's trying to signal to Trump, if you're not going to make a deal with us, we will sell our products elsewhere. But it's going to come at a risk. You know what I mean? And the thing is that industrial strategy is two things. It's industrial and it's also strategy. And I worry that, Carney is betting on a promise that the Chinese will invest in our auto sector in the next 3 years. But we've heard heard those promises before. And auto workers in Ontario basically, don't live and don't feed their families on promises. They don't, a wing and a prayer is not enough for industrial strategy. People live paycheck to paycheck. They don't live on talking points that are like, for 2030, we're going to have these investments, or 2035, we're going to have these investments in our auto industry. And sure, there are some guardrails that the Canadian government have put into this agreement with China, but are they enough? Are we getting enough? And actually, will the investment come? And I think, we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, the investments, Stellantis, Honda, you name it, Northvolt, some of those have worked out, others have not. But the one way to ensure that they're not going to work out is by, dumping a bunch of potentially Chinese EVs and getting China to have a foothold in our Ontario-based auto sector. I'll just add one more quick thing if I can. I think that Carney's largely betting on the fact that Canadians generally, their sentiment towards China has changed. 4 or 5 years ago, Canadians were angry with China. Now, Canadians are more angry with the U.S., right? And I think that is giving him the allowance to make this deal now. Sure, he's also getting a lot of great stuff for farmers and our fishers, our fish harvesters, you name it. But I think it's basically the fact that Canadian sentiment has changed so much since the hostage crisis, the hostage diplomacy, the 2 Michaels, all that stuff that happened 4 or 5 years ago to where we are today, and the real anger people are feeling towards the States.
The key, though, from a sort of crassly political perspective, will be if that remains the case, Scott, right? Because it changes quickly when they kidnap our citizens, or they, try to invade Taiwan. Like, there are lots of controversial things that could still happen that could swing that public sentiment.
No question. Carney's assuming risk here, and he's assuming risk by having to deal more closely with a regime that has demonstrated flatly that it can't be trusted. But I think that Carney's also, taking the fundamental calculation. And there are raw electoral politics to be considered here, like how's this going to play in St. Thomas and Oakville, of course. But I think his broader analysis is, I've got to figure out this relationship with the United States. And by saying we're going to permit some EVs in and the possibility of many more, that gives him something to take off the table with Donald Trump if Donald Trump is willing to deal. And when Donald Trump holds a press conference and says, CUSMA's irrelevant to me, Canada has nothing I want, go fish. I think that Carney's left with a view that, well, let's call this bluff. Let's start to integrate more with China. And he's going to do the same when it comes to India and with Brazil. And the message will be, let's do a deal, or fine, if you're going to shut the drawbridge closed between Canada and the United States, we will have no choice but to deal with these regimes, however dangerous, however risky, and sometimes however unpalatable that might be.
It's one of the first examples, though, jumping off Scott's point, Kory, where the Prime Minister has done something that could ruffle the bear in Trump, right? In most instances, actually, it's run counter to the messaging during the campaign, and he's done a lot of stuff that you didn't think that they would do in order to take down the temperature. Why on this front do you think the calculation was to do something differently?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, Vashi, because I think this is a very bad deal for Canada. If China was investing in the auto sector and making Chinese EVs in Canada, I think that's a threat to Trump. But exactly 0 vehicles from our auto sector are sold in China. So when Kathleen says, well, if the U.S. doesn't want our products, then we'll sell them someplace else, that's not what's happening here. China is selling subsidized vehicles with stolen IP into our market, which will put at risk our access to the U.S. market, where we do sell a lot of vehicles. And so, the fuzzy end of the lollipop is what Doug Ford and the auto workers in Ontario are getting with this deal. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. So and I don't think it's particularly going to upset Trump. I think Trump doesn't like anyone doing anything with China, but the threat of importing some vehicles into the Canadian market is not the kind of threat that having a Canadian auto manufacturing plant that is Chinese owned producing Chinese vehicles. Now that is actually a threat. That's not what's happening.
Kathleen, last word to you.
Yeah, I don't think that actually Kory and I are saying anything different. I think this is a real concern for Canadian auto workers and for, in fact, our entire auto production manufacturing in Ontario. I think that really when we're looking at this industrial strategy, Carney's making a big bet, you know, and one thing that we noted in the early reads of the agreement is that the auto and the EV importation deal goes for 5 years, whereas the agricultural deal is much shorter. So to use Kory's analogy, the fuzzy end of the lollipop might just be it, right? Like it might not be the good, tasty part. And I'm concerned because this could spell the death nail of our auto industry, which is something that Ontario cannot afford. And that goes back to my original point. Industrial strategy has to be a strategy, long term. Can't be just writing big checks. Can't just be promises on a wing and a prayer. It has to be more than that if we want our workers in our province working.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Thanks, Scott. I know, Scott, you don't. I have 30 seconds if you want to rebut it. I have 30 seconds if you want to rebut it.
I'll tell you what. I don't really agree with either Kathleen or Kory. I think that Carney's making a bet. It's not about investment in plants. I'm not even sure he wants that, to be honest. He wants to scare Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Donald Trump wants to kill the auto sector already. This way he can say, listen, if you want to see North America through the back door in Canada flooded with cheaper but better EVs, well, then we're going to have to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have to breathe some life into the auto sector and CUSMA. I think that's the bet he's making.
Can Trump be scared? I'm going to leave it on that note because good luck answering the question. Thanks, guys. Our Sunday strategy session, Kory Teneycke, Scott Reid, and Kathleen Monk. When we come back, more on this story. One of the 2 men detained by China for more than 1,000 days, Michael Kovrig, will be here to react to the Prime Minister's reset with China. We're back in just a moment.